Welcome to Long Lost Friends. I'm Elizabeth Eve King.
And I'm Andrea Goyan. Elizabeth and I used to do comedy together back when we were 19.
But a little time passed and we lost touch.
We found each other a few years ago and discovered
that I'm an animal lover, a painter, a performer, an award-winning writer, a Pilates teacher, and a naturalist.
Wait, I'm an animal lover, performer, painter, award-winning writer, Pilates teacher, and okay, I'm not a naturalist, but we're long lost friends. And today we're so thrilled to have the opportunity to chat with Gwen E. Kirby. Gwen is a graduate of Carleton College. She has an MFA from Johns Hopkins University and a PhD from the University of Cincinnati. Her stories appear in One Story, Tin House, Guernica, Mississippi Review, Ninth Letter, Smoke Lawn Quarterly, and elsewhere. She's the Associate Director of Programs and Finances for the Sewanee Writers Conference at the University of the South, where she's also a teacher and teaches creative writing. We are thrilled to have Gwen here today to talk to us about her new collection of stories, Shit Cassandra Saw. So welcome, Gwen.
Welcome.
So wonderful to be here with you guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. Thank you for coming.
So, yes, we usually start with pets, but since you don't have any, we're just going to go right to literature.
I don't have a pet. I will say in my heart, I have an imaginary corgi whose name is Newton. And I really hope someday to have a real live corgi whose name is Newton. So
well, there are definite benefits to the imaginary one. You don't have any doggy bags.
It's true.
Or pet sitters when you have to leave town.
Right.
That's always a hassle. But I've had the great opportunity to read the entire collection. Of course, I mean, that the title story for the collection, I have to say, is still probably my favorite. I love Shit Cassandra. Okay, wait, I have to read the entire title for those of you who don't know it, because Shit Cassandra Saw is only the opening. Shit Cassandra saw that she didn't tell the Trojans because at that point, fuck them anyway. So it's a great story.
Yeah, I love that story too. It's really wonderful.
Thank you.
So,
and, you know, that's a great character to choose, I think. You know, this woman whose curse is to see the future and not be believed. I mean, that's such a, and so and there's a personal quality too, you know, to all that.
Yeah, it's so horrifying. I mean, it was a story that it was the very first thing I wrote after the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And I hadn't written for about, gosh, a month or so, because I don't know, I didn't know what to do with how angry I was. And I started thinking about Cassandra and I just was like, yeah, fuck them anyway. And I just sort of started listing all of these things all the beautiful things that I imagined this woman got to see that no one ever asked her about or listened when she spoke. So it was kind of a cathartic. I feel like when you read it, you feel like a sort of cleansing of the narrator. And I certainly, as the writer, felt that way too.
Yeah, it's fabulous. And how did the collection come about? Was that part of it? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the collection came about in part just because I was trying to learn how to write. And so I was, writing stories. I think the oldest story in the collection is Disneyland of Mexico, which was written, gosh, possibly as far back as 2014. I don't want to out myself for how long it's taken me to write this book, but it's been a long time. And so I was working on various stories, but it was when I wrote Cassandra and then started writing sort of these different flash pieces about women in history that I started to think about, how did what I was writing fit together? And, how might I construct it into something that doesn't feel like sort of just a disparate number of things that I wrote over a long time, but actually feels like a cohesive collection that I hope, has stories that speak to one another.
Interesting. It's it's a very varied collection, I think. I mean, and I enjoyed that because things are different lengths and some things are speculative and some things aren't speculative. It's kind of, but it's all you know, so you kind of, that also is your thread, is that it's all your kind of voice coming through.
I think that that's definitely true. And I think that the collection really, its variety is in a lot of ways a testament to my parents. I grew up in a home that was just absolutely full of books. And I didn't really make much of a distinction between genres when I was picking, what to read. And so I would pick up like some Herman Melville, and then the thing next to it on the shelf would be, Edgar Rice Burroughs. And then I would be reading sci-fi, and then I'd pick up a mystery novel, and then I'd be back to, Charlotte Bronte. And so I think when I write, I've never felt a particular pressure to be like, all right, well, I have to be a realist or I have to be a speculative writer. I feel like those are all just sort of tools that the writer has at their disposal to tell whatever kind of story it is that they're moved to tell.
Now, have you run into any, because I know I had a science fiction detective story, and some people were like, oh, well, we love your book, but we just do detective and yours is science, or we just do science fiction. And, and now I know other friends who haven't had that issue. Have you had that at all with your, we want this from you and your...
I haven't had that issue yet. I think because none of the stories, I don't think I've ever written anything that would really fall into the category of like hard sci-fi, like something that maybe you might find in like Tor or something like that. I mean, and I love those kind of stories, but I haven't written one. I do imagine as I try to figure out, what do I want to write a novel about? That like those questions of like genre and what genre do you fit in and who are you as a writer feel a little bit more rigid than the sort of short story collection, which is, sort of a beast unto itself that you can just sort of be like, it's literary fiction, and then kind of let it contain its multitudes without having to say like, oh, we're going to put this in the fantasy section or the sci-fi section or the literature section. It's sort of, it gets to be its own animal.
Yeah, I think it seems like a lot of these stories cross over more fantasy than science fiction.
Oh yeah. I think more fantasy. Yeah. And more sort of, I wouldn't say like magical realism, but a lot of stories with like only one element that is strange or fabulous or whatever it is, like it's a totally normal lady who's having an affair. There just happens to be a ghost there who's watching, so right. It's like, it's realism, but with one element that's askew.
And do you find that those elements, I mean, obviously they help you tell the story. So, and it does then put it into speculative fiction. Do you search that out, or does that just come to you? Like, you were writing the story about this woman having the affair. What came first, the ghost or the affair, or her, or do you remember?
The ghost kind of came first. So I lived in, so that story is set in Exeter, and I lived in Exeter for a couple of years ago. I was the writer in residence there at the boarding school, and I lived in this, they provided me with an apartment, and I walked every single day past that stone that was just sitting there that said, here George Whitefield preached his last. And it was such a sad little stone. It was like maybe the size of like a suitcase, kind of tilted, just like by the highway. I was like, God, it's such a bummer for this guy, and so I don't know, it was such a sad little monument. And so I was really curious about him, and I ended up researching him, and I just thought, like, I don't know, what would he think of all this? And then I don't know, and then that woman having the affair kind of came into my head, and I just thought, man, George Whitefield, he would not approve. and it kind of took off from there. I mean, I will say, when I have those speculative elements in my fiction, I feel like they're as much for my pleasure as anything else. I think they just make writing really fun. And I think that they bring maybe a certain levity to stories like that one that are, I think, also about really hard subjects like marriage and motherhood and loneliness, and what does it mean to be a woman whose obligations are to everyone but yourself. Having the ghost in there is kind of a way for me to play, even as I explore those other questions.
Yeah, I think he adds not only a little levity. I mean, he does add he does add a societal problem, kind of a judgment that you can add without having to, it's not as heavy as if you had a character doing it, a living character of the period.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he's definitely like society's judgment, but made manifest in like breeches and a ponytail, which I find to be a more fun way to look at society's judgment than just like a really pissed off neighbor.
Now you have a lot of the stories take place in different countries. Have you traveled to all those places?
I have. Yes, I have. I lived in Buenos Aires for a couple of years after college, and I visited that little Welsh town in Patagonia. And I remember at the time I just was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I was just like in the pampas, and there were gauchos and all these things. And then we pulled into town on this bus I was in, and all of a sudden there was like afternoon tea and tea cozies and this really, and like signs in Welsh, and just this incredible tiny history that was so rich and so interesting. And I think a lot of times when a story finally comes out, it'll be a setting or a place that I've kind of like carried in my heart and in my mind for a long time. And then I'll finally find like the right character to speak that through. I mean, the Disneyland of Mexico is set in a city that I lived in for summer when I was 16. That is by far the most autobiographical story of the collection. I've been to the island of Inishmore. So yes, prior to the pandemic, I was very, very lucky to get to do a decent amount of traveling.
Yeah, you and Elizabeth share that. Elizabeth has done a lot of travel, and a lot of her writing reflects that too.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, though oddly enough, I lived in Korea for a year, and I've never written anything about Korea.
It's so weird how that works. I mean, as I said, I lived in Buenos Aires for 2 years, and it was some of the most important time of my life, and a place that I really love. And I have not said a story there, and I don't know why. Maybe it's just too big, or maybe there's a story coming down the road to. But
it's weird. It is weird. I don't know. I mean, I had like, I could write true things, really great adventures. But when I lived in Mexico, like magic realism and stories just infiltrated me. Whereas Korea, it was such a different culture. I don't know. But that's an interesting.
It's strange.
So
where's one of your favorite places?
Oh gosh. Well, Buenos Aires for sure is my favorite place I've ever lived. I was really lucky in college to study at the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies at Oxford. And I think that was one of the coolest places I've ever lived. I mean, I love history, and you could not go out for pizza without it being like, also Shakespeare ate here once, and it was just like, oh my gosh, like there's just history everywhere you go. And I loved that. I thought that was just really marvelous.
What was your PhD in?
It was in English literature.
Okay. So that's where you finished it, or did some research at Oxford?
No, that was as an undergrad.
Okay. And Buenos Aires?
Buenos Aires was right after college. I was a Latin American studies and Spanish minor. And so I knew, I don't know, it seemed like an awful lot of studying and work to do if I didn't actually go live there afterwards. So it was, I found a room on Facebook, and I moved down there, and eventually found jobs and made it work.
Wow.
An adventurer spirit for sure.
Yes, although a very cautious one. I feel like I got there and I was like, oh my God. And then I just like stayed in the room for the whole first day, and then finally took like one walk around the block, and I was like, done, and then little by little I got there.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how, and Elizabeth, I don't think you've had a chance to read this story. Midwestern girl is tired of appearing in your short stories. The title's so great. So tell us a little bit about that story, how that came to be.
Yeah, so that story sort of had two roots. One, I was very lucky during my PhD to read for the Cincinnati Review. And so I was reading the slush pile for this literary magazine. And I definitely noticed as I was reading it that there were a lot of stories where like unnamed women characters just sort of like popped into the story, said something to help the male protagonist on their journey, and then either like disappeared or were like conveniently murdered so that the man could like have a feeling about it, and I was like, I don't love that. And then I was at a reading at AWP, which is a major writers conference, and this guy had a character in his story that just, it kept appearing, and the only thing she was referred to the whole time was Midwestern girl. And I just was like, I remember I wrote in my notebook, I was like, what an incredible superhero that would be, you know? And I was like, kind of like doodling like a little cape, and I was like, Midwestern girl. And so I started sort of writing these little scenarios kind of in my notebook that was just like all these different little moments where Midwestern girl would pop up in a story. And I thought, like, what if eventually she sort of became sentient and was able to take over the narrative for herself, which is what she does at the end of the story. And it was just sort of I feel like it's in many ways like a very literary story, in the sense that it draws on a lot of my frustrations with some of the particularly like older literature that I've read, where I feel like women are just sort of these props that help male characters on their journey. And I was like, Midwestern girl would not allow for that. So I'm gonna write a story where that's not what happens.
Trying to shift all that. You said that, and it made me just think back to when Elizabeth and I used to do improv together. Women were definitely the props. Period. It was very hard to go beyond that at the time.
Oh gosh, I bet.
Wouldn't you say, Elizabeth?
Yeah. And well, and we were too young to have the confidence to say, you know, hey, that's my idea, asshole.
Yeah.
And now I would.
Right.
But
No, I
at the
know.
time it was like, okay, I guess I'm just, you know, and that makes you not, your ideas may be great, but they're not, you know, you can't
Yeah,
fulfill
absolutely.
them.
And also I think like I know for myself, I didn't notice when I was reading, when I was,
Oh,
you know,
that's so
16,
true.
17, 18, 19. I just was like, oh yeah, like what, yeah, well, you know, of course a male protagonist is like a neutral gender protagonist, and like of course books with a female protagonist are only for girls, and of course the best thing this female character can do in the novel is die of consumption while like the hero like sheds a tear and then moves on. And then yeah, you get older and you read more and you start to be like, wait a minute, that's not the kind of story I want to tell. That's not really the kind of story I want to read.
I think I don't know, for me, I found it really like my books have mostly, my novels have male narrators. And I think it's taken me 4 of them now to realize that.
So interesting.
Where it's like, wow.
Yeah. I mean, I love writing from the point of view of men too. And I've got a few, one of my favorite stories in the collection is Jerry's Crab Shack, 1 star. And I love the protagonist of that. And he's a man, but I found that so much of my, I guess so many of the ways that I kind of wanted to push against what I was seeing in literary fiction, but also so many of the stories where I feel like I get to let some of my own anger and frustration out. I feel like women protagonists for me really allow me to do that in a way that when I'm writing in a male voice, I feel like I'm exploring different things when I'm writing in a male protagonist voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trying to think if I have many. I guess I have some men in mind, but
No, it's interesting because it was in every man, not in every woman, who sort of goes through all these different afterlives in this one book. And then I have detective, you know, it's classic detective, but so I've made he's a classic detective. He's just struck by lightning, but I'm like, now I think I would have said, oh, I think I'll switch him to a woman.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, we change and grow as writers, you know, it's just.
Well, and change and
Or
grow.
an octopus. Maybe I would have make him an octopus, a detective octopus.
Oh, that would
like
be
going
cool.
around like, ooh, I feel that there's.
Yeah, I mean, I think although there's such pushback against so many of the changes that are happening now, but I think the changes that are happening in the growth for women and writers and women in speculative fiction and women in general,
But we can't pass the EPA. That's over. I'm sorry. Sorry. I too have. We're in the rage section. This is the rage section of the show.
I like seeing all the younger women though, who seem to be so much further ahead than I was at their age, as far as standing for themselves and recognizing a lot of those tropes that I wasn't aware of even. Like,
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I mean, I get to teach undergrads here at Swami, and I am amazed at just how aware and perceptive they are, and attuned to what's going on in the narratives that they're consuming. I mean, it's just, it fills me with just like joy and hope, honestly. Teaching is just, it's so wonderful, and the students here are just really great kids.
well, joy and hope, that's
Yeah.
much needed.
Yes. Boy, is it.
Much needed.
Yeah.
Was there anything else you want to tell us about your book?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess I would say to anyone who hasn't read it, you know, I think we're talking about lots of, like, you know, anger and literary ideas and all those things, but I really hope for anyone who reads it that they find it really approachable and accessible, and I hope that they find it very funny. I think for me, the way that I've learned how to cope with anger and uncertainty in my life has definitely been through humor. And I think that coping mechanism has developed into what I hope is a book that is a joy, I hope, to read, even as it tackles some of the things that are really hard and really frustrating right now. So,
well, I think that's very true. I mean, I've read the whole thing, and it didn't feel like I was being personally accosted, or that you were saying, you know, you were attacking anybody. It was very, very approachable. And as I said, there's a variety. So, you know, they're all delightful. You know?
Unfortunately, I haven't been able to read the whole book, but like even just with Cassandra Saw, it's heart-wrenching, it's historical, it really makes you think, but it's funny, even while it's twisted. You know, it's not like, I mean, it's very, you know, emotionally, but it's funny too, you know.
It's funny and thought-provoking.
Yeah, funny and thought-provoking, and yeah, it stays with you too. It's like this, it's something that lingers in your mouth and keeps your thoughts moving, and you know, and that concept, yeah, all the beauty and all the unlistened to.
well, that is very kind. Thank you so much.
Oh no.
So Elizabeth, I think we've reached that point in our show.
We've reached that point. Oh, look, I'm going to do something really. So this is a point of one of my favorite points of the show, where we share the best or sometimes the weirdest thing we learned this week. But we do keep it positive. And it's not usually something like, oh, I just published a book. It's more, you know, general.
Although it can be.
What?
Although it can be.
And I'm going to, this first one, okay, it's a little long, and I leave tomorrow. Okay, wait, I'm going to try and do this really cool thing here. I'm painting a mural at a science museum. This is the Hubble telescope image on the barn. And it's made of, what do you call that? Corrugated metal. So in the corrugated metal, I'm making like cracks, and into the cracks, you can see into different biomes. And so this is going to be like a jungle one. And then the bottom part, which, well, it's not here, it's not behind me, this is virtual, but it will be underground. And so what I'm going to do is leaf cutter ants, and leaf cutter ants are amazing. They carry around ants. If you've been in the jungle, you've seen them. There's a little guy that sits on the top of them, a really teeny ant that just picks bacteria off and watches out for things. And they take the leaves, and underground they grow mushrooms on them, and they eat the mushrooms. But one of the things that's amazing, and even according to the USDNA, not that they're my great source, but because they can't break down the cellulose themselves, their fungus helps to digest it for them. And they're using that in all kinds of new human breakdown things, including antibiotics, because they coat things with antibiotic resistant bacteria on their fungus. And they're just discovering this and using that. And I found that was really interesting. And I also found out that like a huge amount of the percentage of the forest is actually the poop of the leafcutter ants. Like a much larger, something crazy, like a 35-45%.
Wow.
So that's my cool fact.
Wow. Okay, my cool fact this week is I just was reading about these, what they call baby dragons of Slovenia. And there's this cave that people go to, and they are blind salamanders called olms. I think it's how you would say it, OLMS. And their genome is 16 times longer than ours. And they're doing a lot of research because of their great regeneration properties, their regenerative properties. They said they're like 25 centimeters long, so what, like around 9 inches, and they can live up to 100 years, which is crazy. And they can go up to 7 years with no food and still survive. And when they're born, you can't tell the males from the females by their DNA. But when they're babies, they finally had some babies. And when they're born in this captive place, and when they're born, they have eyes for several years until the skin grows over their eyes. And that is my weird fact.
Wait, there's a sexual difference?
There is a sexual difference, but you can't tell it by the DNA. It was a little unclear. You know how articles are, but it was that the DNA, you can't tell from their DNA which is male and which is female.
Wow.
So pretty cool.
Yeah,
That's very cool.
Gwen, what do you want to share?
Okay, well, I don't have like a fun fact, but I have sort of like a fun thing I did this week and a sort of, I don't know, encouragement to others like me. So I don't know about you all, but I found the pandemic to be like pretty stifling, and I could not be more sick of being myself. I'm like, oh my God, I'm still me. This is never ending. And so I took advantage. In my tiny town, there's a man who teaches a beginning woodworking class. And I was like, I am just going to sign up. I have never woodworked in my whole life. But I made a cheese board this week that I brought in. So it's a lovely cheese board.
Oh, that's beautiful.
No, it's got like little beautiful edging and everything.
Little inlays.
Well, little inlays. This is ambrosia, maple, cherry, and teak.
Oh, nice.
That's gorgeous.
And it was such a neat experience. I've never used a table saw or a router or a miter saw or any of those things. And it really just reminded me that like taking even tiny little steps outside of my comfort zone is just it's just so refreshing and so affirming. And I got to meet a fascinating man who, has lived in the area and taught woodworking for 40 years. And it was really splendid. And it just really kind of like reaffirmed my desire to learn new things and do new things. And, so I don't know, I wanted to bring that in and just sort of be like, woo. And I ate some cheese off of it. So that was a win-win. And it was a really cool experience. And I'm going to go back for intermediate woodworking and learn how to make a bookshelf.
Oh, nice.
Oh,
yeah, I'm with you. Anytime I can do, Elizabeth and I both paint, but anytime I can do something that just pushes different directions for my mind, it's just so uplifting.
It's so nice. And it's so wonderful. And you guys will know this, but like as a writer, you're just always making this huge word tangle. And it's so lovely to just be like, look, it's a board that holds cheese. Or like, look, it's a hat that keeps your head warm, and you're just like, I made the object. I know what the object is. It can be really satisfying.
It is, really.
oh yeah.
So,
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much.
yes.
It's
thank
been a
Thank
pleasure
you.
talking about your book. And I really, thank you for the woodworking thing, because that's so true. We need to just break out and, not only will it free and improve your writing, but it makes you realize, wow, there's more to life than you don't have to just be a writer,
Yes.
There's life.
Yes, there's
There's
so
all
much
that
out
shit
there.
Cassandra saw.
Yes,
Somebody
all
has
that
to
shit
do it.
Cassandra saw. Cassandra would be like, girl, get out of your house. What are you doing?
So build a woodboard, Cassandra. And then
Yeah,
hit those
exactly.
Trojans.
Yeah.
So, and we thank you. And we thank, of course, Maria and Alex Korolov for being our editor and producer for this show.
Yes, we couldn't do it without them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to our MetaStellar channel so you won't miss any upcoming episodes. And MetaStellar is a speculative fiction magazine run by volunteers. We publish original science fiction, sci-fi, and fantasy stories. And if you want to help support our publication, check out our Patreon page, where all donations go to paying our authors so we can offer new original stories. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.